In my fantasy, the origin of the word architecture derives from Homer's time. Architecton speaks more of practitioner their disciplines. My country, Paraguay, is officially bilingual. So from now, I ask your permission and invite you to vocalize imaginatively about the word architecture. We know its etymology is in the word architect, from the Greek architecton, someone who directs a construction. Arcos plus tecton. But I like to imagine a different constructions makeup. Perhaps the discipline could instead be defined as arquitectónica, a word not far from the original, since arc, or in Greek arcos, is the beginning, origin, or historical, plus the word tectónica, which essentially has to do with matter, geology, finally geography, and can also be associated with textures or fabrics. Ariana toward fabrics, thus the two threads of Ariadna become part of my definition of architecture in this thesis. Arc, origin, history, tectonics, texture, matter, geography. History and geography, space and time. It's also a happy coincidence that the representation of thread at right angles acts as a tribute to Le Poème from the L'Anglais droit by Le Corbusier. The Argentine architect, the Argentine architect Rafael Iglesias, to whom I owe much admiration and affection, had the ability to construct very intelligent and provocative phrases. One of these most recurring thought was a catalyst from this thesis. When we don't assume that South American history begins with the arrival of the Spanish, especially around the Rio de la Plata, where the construction of great sedentary monuments, like those of the Incas or Aztecs, was non-existent, the story is not at all brief. It took 12,000 years for Homo sapiens to arrive from Africa, the cradle of humanity, so nothing is brief in our history. I believe that we Latin Americans are more geographic, at least Paraguayan. And I think that the European Old World and Millennial Asia identify as more historical. The name America originates from a geographer called Americo Vespuccio, and the continent was discovered by solving geographical unknowns. As I've said, Paraguayans are undoubtedly more geographic, and I've already mentioned the fact that our monuments are natural rather than constructed. Our 12,000 years old indigenous people live us with a very particular heritage, different from the rest of Latin America. We are the only bilingual nation with a narrative language. Guarani is the name. This is what I referred to at the beginning of this presentation. Alongside other interpretations, the name Paraguay has a geographical meaning, one best expressed as water that goes to the sea. Continuing from this symbolic name, it is important to say that the Guarani people were nomadic, walking the entire geography of the region in search of the myth of the land without evil. In Guarani, we said Ubu Marane. In the South America politicized by the Spanish, Paraguay was a vast territory, even the Atlantic Ocean to the south before the name Mar del Paraguay. Then followed a viceroyalty conflict as two wars, leaving Paraguay reduced in population and territory to its current state. But these people baptize an immense geography, their rivers, hills, streams, meadows, forests, towns, and cities. With the exceptions of Paraguayans, a regular citizen of South America, in particular one from the Rio de la Plata, would use these names, words, without recognizing their meaning. But in fact, these names are loaded with meaning and content. I also met several times with Paulo Mendes da Rocha and more often with colleagues trained in his studio. Anyone who has witnessed or read his conference knows his passion for geography. In Daniele Pisani's book, Genealogy of the Imagination of Paulo Mendes da Rocha's way of thinking is presented clearly and represents how to observe geographical aspects before such a historic city. The thread of time, history. This is the second thread that we imagine Ariana offered until by the myth. It's impossible to learn history without geography, and vice versa. Following the thread of Daniele Pisani's book, he coincidentally became interested in the concept of paradigm, citing Giorgio Agamben. Where does where does the entanglement originate? Where to start unpicking Ariadne's threads? The hypothesis is that this origin is a new paradigm, a new historical reference for search. One more hypothesis alongside many others. Let's see these 3 points. Internationally, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the end of the Cold War, the end of history according to Fukuyama. No right without the left. Locally, in Paraguay, the dictatorship, the oldest in South America, is toppled. I was born and educated under this regime. As if the genocidal war against the Triple Alliance, the Chaco War, was not enough. The fall of the dictatorship in 1989 gave us the possibility to be free. Finally, in 1981, Professor Tim Berners-Lee creates WWW. These were the 3 points. Will this be the most transversal effect of the planets? Talking about WWW. For this entanglement, we enter the labyrinth. Entanglement was the original idea referred to in the introduction, but thinking as an architect at a distance, the most successful image is a labyrinth. Playing theater for a moment as a script using our new version of the threat of Ariadne, it would be a real drama to imagine Theseus and the Minotaur as a different characters. Perhaps Theseus becomes the Minotaur of the other or the other way round, or finally they are the same character. Originally, though, of us a third thread that finally represents culture. The mind's world is untangible, and since we mentioned Hegel at the beginning, let us view the labyrinth through a dialectical lens, figurative and abstract. The Basque sculptor Jorge Oteiza, for whom I have deep admiration, in trying to define a work of art, refer precisely to the abstract and the figurative as follows. Stephen Kearns details, he says, a culture of time and space should be quoted and left in support for this point. It is fact Thomas Kuhn's argument for the concept of scientific revolution, that is, how knowledge evolves and how cultures revolutionize a proportion to technological advances. A global technological revolution will be triggered, giving the world a different complexity. Afterwards, basic educations and transmissions of knowledge will be insufficient, and thus the need for already exciting specialists will arise. The central point of the figurative abstract problem is specialization. A specialization is interested in the particular and not the general. It fragments the world into a thousand parts in its attempt at abstracting. The consequence may be a loss of overview, something very important, until it arrives at extreme abstractions that today form part of our fragmented life. After a conference at the last Biennale di Pisa in 2019, Fabrizio Plessi, with whom I had the honor of sharing a table, commented, "Imagine that experience without measuring the difficulty of the shape of the bread. I mean, to eat the thing ingredient by ingredient. First, they would try only the bread, then the ham, the prosciutto, one by one, without experiencing the whole, the true sense of preparation, all the ingredients, all the same time, I can't find a better explanation for specialization. Areas of knowledge that for a long time shared the same space have been separated. They now find themselves in useless and anachronistic debates about limits and power, which waste more energy in disputing policies than proposing practical solutions. In the following years, schools continued their careers through a specialization updating that replaced classical knowledge. There is a significant dismissal of art in general, at least in South American schools. I do not understand how it is that urban planning is currently separated from architecture in education and professional practice. Even worse, that is conceived as a specialty, or at the very least, architecture should be defined as a specialty of urban planning. As of the letter gives figurative dimension of the form to the former. We should put architecture and urban planning back in the same classroom or office. Students should start the first year of architecture school with city, towns, planning lessons. And initial students, like any ordinary citizens, enters university with enters university with a general education and an aptitude to read maps and understand concepts that have always been part of their history, such as geography and politics. These topics of general culture are more accessible than reading technical plans. Starting materials, assembly project, or acquiring knowledge of specific construction technologies. All things that can be learned in parallel. It would be like trying to learn from the detail of a mechanical part, be it a screw, a filter, or a transmission arm, without showing the whole machinery. Modern architecture. Take a modern architecture school take abstraction as an identity, and their bad students produce summary rather than synthesis. But even so, having found their way or through multidisciplinary solution, many architects' practices becomes abstract without them realizing it. A whole generation that specializes in management emerges, while another less interesting large part is obsessed with responding to the market and its speculations. Here, business becomes their specialization. To all the multidisciplinary difficulties mentioned, Latin America must, must also add its common problem, treating figuratively the chronic crisis and, above all, the effort to raise the poverty line is what make us abstract in the international concert regarding the concert. To be figurative is to be multidisciplinary, meaning to play the role of a conductor, a kind of multi-instrumentalist who knows the complex whole and arrives the whole and arrives at a solution. Willem Flusser, by the early 80s, had already suggested themes of aesthetics that 20 years later became for Sigmund Bauman everyday things. Bauman's mature essays are relatively recent, and a few authors have published on the subject uh, have published on the subject the digital world as a cultural phenomenon. The problem in question did not really concern several of the aforementioned people. These do not include Italo Calvino, who, in his inspired style, prepared his essay, Six Proposals for the New Millennium, in 1985, prophesizing what was to come. And indeed, what we're experiencing now. His first speech, entitled Likeness, refers to the subject in the following way. Perhaps due to the fragility to tools still present, we tend to underestimate the current generational proposal, creating great cultural features. And it's precisely now faced with two fundamental cultures and lifestyles, one offline and the other, one on offline and the other online. That things get more difficult in the educational system. And now we don't sense that either will supplant the other and cannot imagine one disappearing. When certain technologies brush up against the sensitive real of power, the variables multiplies and lose control. Castells writes, power is fundamentally exercised by constructing meaning in the human mind. Just look at the number of socio-political crises of recent years, from Hong Kong and India in Asia, Paris and Barcelona in Europe, and Latin America, once in Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia, just to mention a few. Flusser's research was focused on subjects and images in relation to body action and phenomenology, but essentially it defined the problem of image through dimensions. In other words, offline culture occupies the third dimension, the volumetric, while online culture unfolds two-dimensionally on a plane, all produced by technical images. Perhaps this is something visualized and intuited by moving through the labyrinth, a combination of the virtual and the real world. The analog world is being replaced by the digital one. In order not to extend this point, will look at just three concepts: virtual reality, augmented reality, and BIM system. We can imagine our protagonist, Teseo, and the Minotaur inside the labyrinth with these tools. The first and least useful concept, while it's not limiting of our imagination, is capable of transforming to the labyrinth into a paradisiacal Caribbean beach or a futuristic city. On the contrary, augmented reality doesn't lose the original idea of the labyrinth, but adds other visions. Perhaps Theseus could see what is beyond the corners of the corridors or behind the walls, as if augmented reality endowed our protagonist with superpowers without losing context. Ariadna from outside the labyrinth could conceivably visualize what is happening inside. The BIM system deals is simultaneously with detailed information as well as offering information of time and energy. Calculation in order to manage the journey through the labyrinth. My generation practically followed the same model as older ones. Those who choose the path of computers were no weirdos. We read books, and our research spaces were libraries. Television, which somewhat displaced the radio, was the strongest medium. The accumulated newspaper in our homes were the result of informing ourselves day by day. All the medium facilities access to information, but our teacher taught us we the same techniques with which they were themselves educated. In short, there was continuity in generational terms, coinciding with Sigmund Bauman's works. But back then, a slower speed allowed through an action to proceed more calmly. Regarding slowness, Bauman's theory are sustained through the idea of liquid cultures, more precisely by its speed and constant change of course, as occur with the behavior of liquid produced by the new media and tools. Such speed results in significant fragmentation, and it's impossible to assimilate so much information while it is being received. The Argentine critics and architect Roberto Fernandez referred in a very interesting article on slowness to an essay by Pierre Sansol. At this point, we are deep inside the labyrinth, and a crucial decision in the speed at which we'll continue traveling in the Odyssey. Teseo is surely walking slowly with all his senses well placed. By the way, I think a reasonable as a pedagogical system for creativity, a curious article of boredom that's included in thesis. Boredom or entertainment boredom or entertainment, figurative or abstract, off or on. This is what puts the imagination in crisis. The crisis of the imagination is neither less or absence of it. It is when there are more questions than answers. Imagination genealogy is the human brain, is in the human brain, the labyrinth. It's definitely a complex process in the mind. If we agree that in this brain or labyrinth, intelligence occupies an area and an important role, would artificial intelligence occupy another? Are they fighting to occupy the same area? As Castell said, it is a task to rewire our minds. As a definition for a crisis, it is better to leave this chapter here with more intelligent questions than answers. Anyone can say that it's free of contradictions. Excuse me, what's a question? Anyone can say that it's free of contradictions. In the Laboratorio de Arquitectura, we agree with Hegel, thinking that after contradicting ourselves, we involve we involve. Why review laboratory projects? Until today, the Laboratorio de Arquitectura builds all its practice and professional thinking with geography, matter, structure, and gravity. Almost all the projects, works, and essays were focused on what was after discipline or by discipline, as was the concept of architecture engineering. The experience of projecting a building, the Casa Oscura, unconsciously propose a new genealogy of our imagination, starting from imagining a different architecture, a machine for capturing images, a live projection, not as a metaphor build. Finally, represented by the Dark House, a new artistic project took place. The black box or Maerapitu, like the black box of an airplane, or all the flight long of the laboratory is represented by the dark house. Although it was an educational artwork, it physically suggested architecture. The box is a cube of 1 meter with a pinhole where light or urban images entered. Simultaneously, it was equipped with internet service and a video camera that transmitted via YouTube. Anyone could access this free service, physically interacting and observing the urban context that occurred within it. Two generations reunited in the same place and time. The older generation observes from outside. The younger one is outside but observes the interior. Both coincide in time, but not in space. Perhaps if they communicate politely to overcome the crisis, that is the transmission of knowledge. They would coincide in time and in double space, the interior and the exterior. The black box will be an urban equipment, not a prototype, not an abstract. It will be designed as a specific part of a city. It will fit. It will be figurative from the complexity, from many trades or disciplines, and its essential function is education. The black box originally function was celebrated in the public space, but today it would fluctuate before the orders of social distancing and online relationship of stay at home that would be part of a new culture. Conclusion. If I already refer to topics that passionate me more than the ones developed in this thesis, but as Ernesto Sabato wrote, I do not choose the topic. The topic has chosen me. Perhaps originally was investigation. This investigation was different and it has inevitably taken a turn. On the other hand, I always propose the following question to a student in a final statement. Would you do the same project again? Would you change something of what has been presented? I must clarify that the final draft of this work was delivered a month before a COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. Therefore, this virus should have affected this work too. If we are facing a new paradigm, the 1989 paradigm would be disqualified and would be invalidate this job. Or in the best case, the referred paradigm was replaced in 30 years. If 1981 was a dose with long-term effects and 2020 with the COVID-19, a test to confirm a diagnosis of crisis of the imagination, then it will have been a worthwhile to deal with the subject, and 30 years will have been part of the 100 years in how long it takes the chickens to learn not to cross the street. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know if there are questions or comments.